This is the BBC.
Thanks for downloading Analysis. A few days ago, British politics saw a stunning result with a massive swing in the Copeland by-election. In her second programme, looking at how we vote, Professor Rosie Campbell asks, why do voters switch parties?
We have become a nation of swingers.
I had a terrible moment, and that sort of shattered the mirror for me. I should have left before. I wish I had now.
A huge number of voters have abandoned political loyalties that they had nurtured for decades.
Although it didn't change my mind overnight, it really worried me. It planted a real doubt.
It wasn't just my generation that was disenchanted by Iraq. It was a whole swathe of people across the generations.
Why are so many voters changing their minds from one election to the next? Are the political parties facing disaster, or is this a brave new world? As voters move rapidly from one party to another, they bring about startling political upheavals.
Labour has suffered a stunning by-election defeat to the Conservatives in the Cumbrian seat of Copeland, one of its northern heartlands. The seat had been represented by Labour since 1935.
In the last programme, we found out how voters decide what to do. Age-old allegiances based on class, religion and issues such as the economy are dwindling. And the power that parties used to have over us is fading. So this week I'm asking, what makes voters change their minds? Jane Green, Professor of Politics at the University of Manchester, has been watching our voting habits with a keen eye. As co-director of the British Election Study, she tracks the vote choices of thousands of members of the public and watches as voters swing from one party to another.
I would expect a really decent proportion of every constituency in the UK to find people that are certainly thinking about voting in different ways. And the most important point is that that has changed substantially over time.
If you look back to the 1960s, around 13% of voters would change which party they voted for. Now, in 2015, that was closer to 40%. A really large proportion of voters are swingers. And this has been steadily increasing in each subsequent election since the 1960s.
Dr. Jonathan Mellon from Nuffield College, Oxford. That figure from the British Election Study is astonishing. 40% of respondents had moved parties. Jane Green puts that 40% into perspective.
Though the Tories won a majority in 2015, they increased their vote share by less than 1%.
When a swing of less than 1% is enough to form a government, a movement of up to 40% of the electorate is potentially explosive. On the night of the 7th of May 2015, we witnessed some dramatic changes, a surge in support for the SNP in Scotland and UKIP across the UK, plus a sudden drop in support for the Liberal Democrats. But as recent by-elections show, May 2015 was not a one-off in terms of volatility. Swing voting has been increasing steadily for years, and it shows little sign of stopping. Millions of people are now potential swing voters, and that poses a challenge to our entire political system. There have always been some swing voters. The classic swing voter has no particular allegiance to any one party and may choose a different party from one election to the next. And it is the swingers who decide the outcome of an election, but they usually do this indirectly.
What tends to happen is either you'll get swings from the major parties to minor parties, such as traditionally the Liberal Democrats, but now also UKIP, the Greens, the SNP, or you'll see the switch in the other direction. People who had swung to the Liberal Democrats before will swing back to one of the major parties.
John Mellon. General elections have traditionally been won by whichever of the two major parties, Labour or Conservative, has lost the fewest votes. But the individual who swings away from a major party is making a bold move. In our first past-the-post electoral system, a vote that is not cast for the two main parties risks being a wasted vote. Candidates from minor parties are usually very unlikely to win. So why would a voter decide to use their choice in this way? Joe Twyman, Head of Political and Social Research at the polling company YouGov, analysed swing voting at the most recent general election.
Well, one way of shifting that surprised a lot of people was the move from the Liberal Democrats to UKIP. And when people saw the data on that, they would say, well, hang on, That doesn't make any sense. The ideology and the policies of Liberal Democrats are very different from those of UKIP. Why should people do that? Now, a comparison can be drawn in the October 1974 general election. A large number of voters switched from the Liberal Party to the National Front. Now, that may seem completely contradictory, but again, it's a repeat of the same sort of thing. It's not about policies, it's not about personalities, it's simply about protest.
It is too easy to view swing voters as fickle protesters. But what would it take to turn more voters into swingers? In 2003, for many people, it was this.
Go! To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk.
I think my generation was quite significantly shaped by the Iraq War.
Tom Southern was once a committed socialist and backed the Labour Party. Now he's a Liberal Democrat activist. He has stood as a Lib Dem councillor and has campaigned for his local Lib Dem MP. What was it about the Iraq War that made him change his mind?
Firstly, politicians taking decisions that we didn't agree with. And secondly, the realisation that no matter how much we protested, they weren't going to stop. They weren't going to change their mind. A lot of people switched to, for example, the Lib Dems back then, not necessarily because they were Liberals. In that generation, it was sort of the protest, anti-establishment vote.
Tom Southern was not alone. In 2005, the Labour Party lost over 1 million votes, a swing of 5.5%. The Lib Dems gained over 1 million votes, with a swing of 3.8%. But swing voters are notoriously changeable. John Mellon.
The Lib Dems tended to lose around half of their voters from one election to the next. They were also getting an inflow of new voters, which topped them up. But they tended to lose about half of the voters they had at each election, which is a very, very high level of loss.
And in the 2015 general election, that reliable inflow of new voters did not appear.
I do strongly feel that the Lib Dems have been tarnished by the coalition tuition fees. I think it took probably a lot longer for Labour voters to peel away from Labour, whereas tuition fees was a very clear break in terms of sort of polling and things like that. It was clear immediately that sort of around half the support had been wiped out within months, if not weeks.
Minor parties, such as the Liberal Democrats, have been experiencing a roller coaster ride in the past few years. They have seen support wiped out in a matter of weeks, only for their fortunes to rise abruptly with the next twist in politics. At the last general election, the Lib Dems seemed to be on the brink of annihilation. Now they have rebranded themselves as the main anti-Brexit party. They could potentially be about to benefit from another wave of newcomers who aren't fixated on their past betrayals. But making and breaking promises is a risk across the political spectrum.
The three main parties can all spot specific incidents that damage their credibility and their reputation among their own supporters.
Joe Twyman.
Let's look at, for instance, 1992 and Black Wednesday, destroying Conservative supporters' attitudes towards their party's economic policy, losing trust in their party's ability to govern. And then on top of that, you have events such as the global financial crisis and also the expenses scandal that have damaged the reputation of the political class in general. Combine those together and you have a potent damage.
This damage, these broken promises and loss of trust drove many voters away from politics altogether. Between 1997 and 2015, turnout in the UK fell by 5 percentage points. But as long as the main parties suffered together, the outcome of elections was not affected. But then new parties began to rise up.
I actually had the views and beliefs of UKIP long before UKIP existed.
In a temporary election office in Sleaford, Lincolnshire, I met Darryl Pitcher, a UKIP campaign manager and councillor. I asked him what had led him to join a party that had only come into existence in 1993 and only been prominent in politics in the last decade.
I stood in a mock general election in my high school. I stood as an independent, but my basic policy proposal was exactly what UKIP's is today, and that was 5 years before UKIP had even been invented. Over the years, I always regarded myself as an independent, but although that was great, if you wanted to get things done, you needed to work collectively. UKIP represented sort of 95% of the same views as I had, and it made sense to join up with the rest of them and actually get something done.
And UKIP was not the only party joining people together for the first time.
I'm delighted to be standing here with the new Deputy Prime Minister, the two of us together, leading this historic Liberal Democrat Conservative administration.
This is a new government, and it's a new kind of government.
David Cameron led the first coalition government in a generation, and the possibility of a coalition government benefited all the smaller parties, including UKIP. Voters witnessed the Lib Dems, a minor party, take a position of power in partnership with one of the major parties. Voting for a minor party took on a new dimension beyond registering protest. It might mean power. And this became even more apparent in the run-up to the 2015 general election, when the leaders of 7 parties appeared on TV debates. Jane Green.
If you saw within a hung parliament expectation that a minor party could have had a particularly high degree of influence, voting for that party isn't inconsistent with the view that that party is going to go in and have some say. You know, it's going to go in and perhaps pull the government closest to the views that you like, put up an argument about immigration and so on.
The system had for decades forced most voters to compromise. Voters may not particularly have liked either of the two main parties, but most voters stuck with the two main parties anyway. Then, in the 2015 campaign, it looked as though the minor parties would hold the balance of power, and that was the catalyst many voters needed. 1 in every 12 people in the UK voted for UKIP, and 1 in 2 people in Scotland voted for the SNP. Earlier this month, around 120 MPs voted against their constituency over the Article 50 bill. This might in turn prove to be a new catalyst, sending voters spiralling towards other parties.
Harrison Trudy Lynn, the Conservative Party candidate, 13,748.
So far, we have heard that swing voters usually move to or among the minor parties. It's rarer to switch between the two main parties, but this does happen, as we saw with the amazing result in the Copeland by-election.
What has happened here tonight is a truly historic event. We've had Labour here for more than 80 years.
Labour and the Conservatives are painted as bitter enemies. Even the House of Commons architecture gives the impression of two sides pitted against each other.
And maybe even a boss who exploits the rules to further his own career. Remind him of anybody?
The invisible line on the floor between the parties can feel uncrossable. But here is what happened on Tuesday, the 26th of June, 2007.
Could I say that we very much welcome into the Labour benches, and we hope there are more to come.
I just literally crossed the floor of the House. It was quite dramatic.
After 2 decades as a Tory MP, Quentin Davies, now Lord Davies, defected from the Conservative Party. He became a Labour MP and is now a Labour peer. But how could a man who sat on the Tory front benches handle life on the other side?
Well, I haven't changed my views very much. I mean, you might think I'm very boring because I've always really believed in the same things. I've always believed in free markets and an enterprise economy. I've always believed in social justice. I've always believed in having good public services and in the principle of the NHS. I've always believed in strong defences. I've always believed in internationalism and our membership of the European Union. That I've changed in no respect, really, all my adult life.
And yet we've asked you on this programme about people changing their minds about politics. Why do you think we might have asked you?
Well, that of course is because the firmament of politics has changed around me in my time. I first joined the Tory party in 1974 under Ted Heath, and the principles I've just outlined would have been his principles at the time. I felt very comfortable at that time in the Tory party. But as you can see, it's changed enormously. With each election, the new incoming members of Parliament were more and more Thatcherite, more and more right-wing, and frankly, I felt less and less sympathy for their point of view.
And there was one view in particular that caused Davies to question his place in the party.
I had a shattering experience after a year in the House of Commons as a Conservative MP. Margaret Thatcher made her Bruges speech.
To try to suppress nationhood and concentrate power at the centre of a European conglomerate would be highly damaging and would jeopardise the objectives we seek to achieve.
That was the first disillusion when I had to think for the first time about whether I really shared the views of the leader of my party.
The Bruges speech was a turning point for the Conservatives. In the 1975 EU referendum, the anti-Europe party had been Labour, but now Thatcher was taking on the mantle of Euroscepticism. The question of Europe caused rifts in the party that are still felt today. Davies remained with the Tories but was a rebellious MP, voting against Thatcher and then John Major on an array of issues. And then came along Tony Blair.
New Labour seemed to represent exactly what I'd always believed in. But of course, the first year or two, I wasn't sure how genuine, how authentic, how permanent that change was. So I didn't rush to join them. I probably took too long to join them. And that's my one regret in politics, as a matter of fact, that I didn't move from the Tory party to the Labour Party rather earlier than I actually did.
Davies had a historical precedent for his actions. Edmund Burke, the philosopher and Whig MP, changed his political views because of the French Revolution. Burke had long argued that MPs should be free to change their minds. An MP should act on the basis of his conscience. Burke explained to his Bristol constituents. "You did not vote for my party," Burke said. "You voted for me and my powers of judgment." In Britain, MPs are elected as individuals and not party members. They don't have to resign if they switch party. But defecting to the enemy is considered a momentous betrayal. Turncoat MPs are vilified as traitors, as Lord Davies discovered.
Obviously, I knew it would cause a lot of ructions in the constituency, and did rather split the constituency party. In my office, I had two people working for me. One strongly supported me, the other was very upset. I knew that sort of thing would happen.
Did you feel a sense of disloyalty?
I hadn't made any personal commitment to anybody, which I was breaking. I thought that I was actually remaining constant, and others were changing, and the Tory party was moving to the right, and I wasn't going to move with it.
The parties are indeed on the move, and that's a key reason why more voters are changing their minds. Since Davies defected, the political scene around him has shifted again. Both Labour and the Conservatives have acquired new leaders who have taken their parties in new directions. We might be about to see a new section of the electorate become swing voters. Here's comedian Katie Brand on Radio 4's News Quiz.
But I feel I am one of the disenfranchised centre now. We've got a government that's too right-wing for me to vote for, and an opposition that's too left-wing for me to vote for, and I feel like I'm this sort of millions of people, the disenfranchised centre. They've managed to alienate millions of us who are quite centre, and I literally have no idea who to vote for.
But you must have a dream person. There must be someone that you think, actually, that's the person that really speaks to me, be it Hilary Benn or Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I think are increasingly interchangeable.
The problem that Lord Davies and Katie Brand describe of feeling uncomfortable within a party does not just affect voters in the centre. Those at the far ends of the political spectrum can suffer from this as well.
I was on the New Left, which was basically Trotskyist in this country, and I used to attend meetings of what was now called the Socialist Workers' Party.
When Daily Telegraph columnist and leader writer Janet Daly first joined the electorate, she placed herself on the hard left. But she didn't stay there.
When I moved, I joined the Labour Party. And when the SDP formed, that seemed quite exciting. And I think I actually joined the SDP at one point. And I was, as you can see, on a kind of trajectory. And finally, I became a voting Conservative.
In the space of a decade, Daly made an extraordinary journey across the political spectrum, from the far left to the radical right. I asked her why she had considered herself a lefty to begin with.
When I arrived at university, it was the 60s, and my generation of students at Berkeley were the original student revolutionaries. Left-wing politics in America at that time particularly was very much to do with civil rights. It was very much to do with segregation in the South, with getting voting rights. It was an extraordinarily courageous period, and I remained in that frame of mind, which is to say left-wing firebrand revolutionary state of mind, and came to Britain in 1965 and stayed on what was then coming to be known as the New Left.
But direct experience of politics, and specifically the British left wing, started to change her mind.
There were aspects of left-wing politics that really disturbed me. There was the traditional Labour Party view, which seemed to me to be very paternalistic and very patronising, and to encourage what I saw as the worst aspect of British working class life, which was passivity and defeatism. It seemed to me then that the Labour Party was saying to people, stay where you are and we'll look after you.
In contrast to the language she was hearing on the left, Daly remembers the rhetoric used by Margaret Thatcher and her advisor Keith Joseph.
And that seemed to say to working class people, You can do this. You can get up. You can get out. You can own your home. You can start a business. You can have your own choices. You can be self-determining in life. And it encouraged all those things we're so familiar with now, aspirational working class attitudes.
Taking you back to the moment that you first went to the ballot box and voted for a party of the right, how did that feel?
Terrific. I mean, it was 1979 when I voted Conservative, and I was so inspired by the Keith Joseph view that Margaret Thatcher was expressing at that time. And I was so angry about the winter of 1979, the winter of discontent, that I had no difficulty at all voting for the opposite.
What did your friends and family think?
A lot of them were going the same way.
There is a well-known phrase attributed to Winston Churchill, Victor Hugo, Edmund Burke, and various other great minds. If you're not a Liberal at 25, you have no heart. But if you're not a Conservative at 35, you have no brain.
I think there is something in the idea that the rational conclusion that you reach when you've actually had a life and raised children and done all the real things, the grown-up things, I think there is something in that.
And what does Tom Southern, our Lib Dem activist, make of this?
Oh, I think my younger self was probably very idealistic, less pragmatic, but that's good. You know, you need people to be idealistic at the end of the day.
Does growing older really make voters change their minds? I find this idea worryingly deterministic. And so I spoke to James Tilley, Professor of Politics at the University of Oxford. As somebody who's just had a significant birthday, I'm wondering whether I can expect to see changes in my political attitudes and beliefs.
The question of whether age affects our political views is a tricky one. In Britain, it is definitely the case that older people are much more likely to vote for the Conservatives than younger people. So there's about a 20-odd percentage point gap between people in their 20s and people in their 70s voting for the Conservatives. So that's definitely true. What's much, much trickier is working out why that's the case. And there's two main possibilities. It could be that people born a long time ago are more likely to vote for the Conservatives. So that's what I call a generational explanation. Or it could be that as we get older, we become more likely to vote for the Conservatives, what I call an ageing explanation. So the generational explanation revolves mainly around the fact that people born a long time ago are typically more socially conservative. So less in favour of gay marriage, more in favour of the death penalty, things like that. The problem is that social conservatism is not that strongly linked to vote choice in Britain. So there's something else going on here that's probably to do with the ageing process itself.
So if we took two people who are alike in all the other important ways, same social class, same kind of values, but one is 20 years older, would that mean that the older person would be voting Conservative versus the younger person voting Labour?
On average, yes, we'd expect that older person to be more likely to vote Conservative.
And why do you think that is? Why do people move to the right as we get older?
I think probably the most plausible explanation is that people just generally become a bit more resistant to change as they get older. And I think also that they tend to perhaps become less idealistic. So if parties on the right represent a platform which is perhaps more favourable to the status quo, it's perhaps more about pragmatism than it is about idealism, then that might be more attractive to older people than younger people.
The fact that older people tend to swing to the right is hugely important because old people are also much more likely to vote than younger people. And John Krosnick, Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, says voters can expect another surprise as they get older.
Progress through the life cycle from age 18 through old age is characterized by essentially a U-shaped curve. People are the most open to changing their opinions on political issues when they are the youngest adults and when they are the oldest. We are most flexible, most responsive, ages 18 to 30, and then again after age 70. And it's the folks in midlife who are in some ways, the most socially responsible. They're in the positions of the greatest social influence, running companies, running countries, running governments. Those people are quite stable in their opinions. But when people are just entering the electorate, they are persuadable and open-minded. And at the end of life, people become more persuadable as well.
But why is that?
Well, what we've seen is that the minute they start having the opportunity to vote or participating in voting, they are inspired to learn more, and they simply have not solidified a base of knowledge and a commitment to their points of view. By the time people are in midlife, they've gathered up information, they've got habits of behavior that reinforce the opinions that they've been living with. The openness at the end of life, we are less clear about. A number of hypotheses have been studied, and none of them actually has been supported. And so it doesn't seem to be the result of people's declining cognitive skills late in life. It doesn't seem to be the result of them, through death, losing friends, their social networks falling apart. So we actually don't know what it is about the end of life that makes people flexible, but we do know that they are.
I love the idea that after half a century of voting, party loyalists in their 70s are suddenly open to new ways of thinking. Watch out for the senior swingers. Swing voting can be empowering, or it can be desperate, the result of disillusionment. Voters have traditionally moved from major parties to minor parties, or between smaller parties, although the rise of issues that cross-cut the left-right divide means this might now be changing. This volatility is a nightmare for the parties. In the past, MPs relied on their core vote to back them no matter what, leaving them free to focus on attracting the tiny number of swing voters they needed to win an election. All of the parties feel enormously threatened by swinging, and they argue that it makes politics less efficient. With voters more likely to defect to other parties, MPs have to spend far more time campaigning to keep their seats, and far less time legislating. But having a plethora of viable parties to choose between ought to be of benefit to voters. Has the balance of power shifted towards voters?
At the moment, people feel quite empowered by switching to minor parties, expressing themselves in ways they haven't within politics before. But we still do have a first-past-the-post system. There's still limits to how much your votes will actually translate into representation in Parliament. And if after a few elections people find that they haven't been having any representation, it's possible that they may end up going back to more of a constrained system and a constrained way of voting that ends up with them more pragmatically getting politicians into Parliament who can go and implement policies they like, even if those politicians are not quite as close to their values as the smaller parties they were voting for.
John Mellon worries that we will return to a static two-party system, but with a huge number of frustrated voters. And yet I feel that having such an enormous number of voters who have changed their minds could still potentially transform politics. In the last episode, we saw that anachronistic connections and biases were pulling us towards a particular party. Voters stuck with parties that had let them down or had morphed into something they didn't like. Even if the future is more chaotic, the rise of the swinging mindset might just be the change our political system so desperately needs.
People are being more open-minded and people more open to argument. I personally welcome that as a general trend. I hope that it's a sign of people being more discriminating. And of course, I hope that they will agree with me.
Analysis was presented by Rosie Campbell and produced by Hannah Sander. If you didn't hear Rosie's first programme from last week on why we vote the way we do, I do recommend giving it a listen. Next week on Analysis, Sarah Smith asks if a second referendum on Scottish independence would yield a different result. And podcast fans, let me repeat myself and urge you to download our new Podcast First series. It's called Intrigue, Murder in the Lucky Holiday Hotel. You'll hear about poison, sex, fistfights, elite Chinese politics and hot air balloons. How can you resist? Do get in touch and tell us what you think. Our address is analysis@bbc.co.uk.